In the southwestern part of Washington state stands Mount St. Helens, a volcano that sits in the Cascade Range about 50 miles northeast of Portland, Oregon. Mount St. Helens is 34 miles, 55 kilometers, west of Mount Adams, in the western part of the Cascade Range. This mountain became part of American history on May 18, 1980, when it erupted in what became the most deadly and economically destructive volcanic eruption in the history of the contiguous United States. The blast killed 57 people and changed the landscape forever. Before 1980, Mount St. Helens was known as one of the most beautiful mountains in America. Its ice cover just prior to the 1980 eruption included 11 named glaciers: Wishbone, Lewitt, Lesky, Forsyth, Nelson, Ape, Shoestring, Swift, Dreyer, Toutle, and Talus. Many people called it the Mount Fuji of America because of its perfect cone shape and snow-covered peak. Mount St. Helens is geologically young compared with the other major Cascade volcanoes. It formed only within the past 40,000 years, and the summit cone present before its 1980 eruption began rising about 2,200 years ago. The mountain had been quiet for more than 100 years, with its last eruption happening in 1857. The story of Mount St. Helens really begins in March of 1980. For over a century, the mountain had been sleeping peacefully. Since its last eruptive activity in 1857, Mount St. Helens had been largely dormant. Seismographs were not installed until 1972. But on March 15, something changed. Small earthquakes started shaking the area around the mountain. At first, these tremors were tiny, barely noticeable. But they kept happening, day after day. Dr. David Johnston was one of the first scientists to arrive at Mount St. Helens when it began showing signs of life. David Alexander Johnston, December 18, 1949 to May 18, 1980, was an American United States Geological Survey (USGS) volcanologist who was killed by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. Johnston was only 30 years old and had already made a name for himself studying volcanoes in Alaska and Colorado. He was passionate about his work and known for his careful attention to detail. Dave Johnston was an exemplary scientist, and his approach to his work was a model for all, dedicated and hardworking, with meticulous organization and observation followed by careful evaluation and interpretation. By March 20, the earthquakes were getting stronger. By March 20, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake shook the wilderness around the volcano. The scientists knew this was serious. Earthquakes like this usually meant that magma was moving deep inside the mountain, trying to find a way to the surface. On March 27, Mount St. Helens woke up with a bang. Around noon local time on March 27, tension was released as the peak of Mount St. Helens burst open, shooting steam 6,000 feet, 1,829 meters, into the air and blasting a 250-foot wide crater, 75 meter, through the summit. For the first time in over 100 years, the mountain was erupting. Steam and ash shot into the sky, creating a dark cloud that could be seen for miles. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, something strange started happening to the north side of Mount St. Helens. The mountain was literally growing a bulge. More than 10,000 earthquakes occurred and the north flank grew outward about 140 meters, 450 feet, to form a prominent bulge, growing 2 meters, 6.5 feet, per day. Day by day, this bulge got bigger and bigger, pushing out at an incredible rate of about 6 feet every single day. Scientists had never seen anything like it. David Johnston and his team were working around the clock to understand what was happening. They knew the mountain was dangerous, but they also knew that people needed to be warned if something big was about to happen. Famous for telling reporters that being on the mountain was like standing next to a dynamite keg and the fuse is lit, Johnston understood the risks but felt it was his duty to stay and monitor the volcano. The scientists convinced the government to keep people away from the mountain. This was not popular with many locals who wanted to return to their homes and businesses, but the scientists held firm. They knew that if the mountain erupted in a big way, it could be deadly. Their decision to keep the area closed would later save thousands of lives. By May, the bulge on the north side of Mount St. Helens had grown to an enormous size. It was over a mile wide and hundreds of feet high. Inside the mountain, hot magma was pushing upward, creating incredible pressure. The whole north side of the mountain was becoming unstable, like a dam that was about to burst. On the evening of May 17, David Johnston was stationed at an observation post called Coldwater 2, about 6 miles north of the mountain. David Johnston at Coldwater 2, 1900 hours, May 17, 1980. Dave did not survive the next day's eruption. Coldwater 2 would eventually be renamed Johnston Ridge, in honor of Dave. He was there with his radio, binoculars, and scientific instruments, keeping watch over the sleeping giant. That night, he sent his usual reports back to his colleagues in Vancouver, Washington. Everything seemed normal. But at 8:32 in the morning on May 18, 1980, everything changed in an instant. With no immediate precursors, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake occurred at 8:32 a.m. on May 18, 1980 and was accompanied by a rapid series of events. The earthquake triggered something that no one had expected. The entire north side of Mount St. Helens began to slide away. What happened next was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. At the same time as the earthquake, the volcano's northern bulge and summit slid away as a huge landslide, the largest debris avalanche on Earth in recorded history. Imagine the entire side of a mountain, billions of tons of rock and ice, suddenly sliding down like a massive avalanche. The total avalanche volume is about 2.5 kilometers 3.3 billion cubic yards, equivalent to 1 million Olympic swimming pools. But the landslide was just the beginning. When all that rock and ice slid away, it was like taking the lid off a pressure cooker. The hot magma inside the mountain was suddenly exposed to the air. As this lateral blast of hot material overtook the debris avalanche, it accelerated to at least 480 kilometers per hour, 300 miles per hour. A massive blast of superheated gas, ash, and rock shot out sideways from the mountain at incredible speed. David Johnston was the first person to witness this catastrophic event. His excited voice crackled over the radio. Vancouver. Vancouver, this is it. These would be his last words. The lateral blast swept over Johnston's observation post, and he was never seen again. Despite a thorough search, Johnston's body was never found, but state highway workers discovered remnants of his USGS trailer in 1993. The blast traveled outward from the mountain like an enormous, deadly cloud. The debris avalanche swept around and up ridges to the north, but most of it turned westward as far as 23 kilometers, 14 miles, down the valley of the North Fork Toutle River. Everything in its path was destroyed. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years were knocked down like toothpicks. The dense forest that covered the slopes of the volcano was reduced to ash inside an area known as the inner blast zone, which extended about 6.2 miles, 10 kilometers, from the summit. But the eruption was far from over. After the initial blast, a massive column of ash began rising into the sky. The ash plume reached a towering height of 80,000 feet, 15 miles, 24 kilometers, before blanketing the surrounding region. For more than 9 hours, Mount St. Helens continued to shoot ash and debris high into the atmosphere. The ash cloud was so big that it could be seen from space. After the initial blast, a massive column of ash began rising into the sky. The ash plume reached a towering height of 80,000 feet, 15 miles, 24 kilometers, before blanketing the surrounding region. For more than 9 hours, Mount St. Helens continued to shoot ash and debris high into the atmosphere. The ash cloud was so big that it could be seen from space. The heat of the initial eruption melted and eroded the glacial ice and snow around the remaining part of the volcano. The water mixed with dirt and debris to create lahars, or volcanic mudflows. These mudflows were like fast-moving rivers of concrete, carrying huge boulders, trees, and anything else in their path. According to USGS, the lahars reached speeds of 90 miles per hour, 145 kilometers per hour, and demolished everything in their path. The destruction was incredible. About 57 people were killed directly from the blast, and 200 houses, 47 bridges, 15 miles, 24 kilometers, of railways, and 185 miles, 298 kilometers, of highway were destroyed. 57 people died, and thousands of animals were killed, according to USGS. The economic damage was enormous, with losses in the billions of dollars. One of the most dramatic changes was to the mountain itself. Before the eruption, Mount St. Helens stood 9,677 feet tall. After the blast, the elevation of the mountain's summit from 9,677 to 8,363 feet, 2,950 to 2,549 meters, leaving a 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, wide horseshoe-shaped crater. The beautiful, cone-shaped mountain that people had admired for generations was gone forever. President Jimmy Carter flew over the area a few days after the eruption to see the damage for himself. U.S. President Jimmy Carter surveyed the damage, and said it looked more desolate than a moonscape. The once green forests and clear lakes had been replaced by a gray, lifeless wasteland that stretched for miles in every direction. But Mount St. Helens wasn't finished. St. Helens produced an additional 5 explosive eruptions between May and October 1980. Each time, scientists held their breath, wondering if it would be as bad as May 18. Fortunately, none of these later eruptions were as destructive as the first one, but they served as reminders that the mountain was still very much alive. Following May 18, Mount St. Helens erupted explosively 5 times during 1980. None of these eruptions was as large as the events on May 18, but each eruption produced ash columns 25,000 to 50,000 feet above sea level. Scientists worked around the clock to monitor each eruption and warn people of any new dangers. As the months and years passed, Mount St. Helens continued to change. 11 eruptions after October 1980 were dominantly non-explosive events that built a composite lava dome about 800 feet high and 2,500 feet in diameter in the crater. This dome grew slowly as thick, sticky lava oozed out of the volcano and hardened into rock. The eruption of Mount St. Helens changed the science of studying volcanoes forever. The 1980 eruption was the first large explosive eruption studied by scientists and observers using modern volcanology. Scientists learned more about how volcanoes work from studying Mount St. Helens than they had learned from decades of previous research. David Johnston's sacrifice was not in vain. The volcano monitoring effort of which Dave was part helped persuade the authorities first to limit access to the area around the volcano, and then to resist heavy pressure to reopen it, thereby holding the May 18 death toll to a few tens instead of hundreds or thousands. His work and that of his colleagues saved thousands of lives by keeping people away from the danger zone. Today, the area around Mount St. Helens has been set aside as a national monument. 2 years after the eruption, the United States government set aside 110,000 acres, 450 square kilometers, of land for the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. Visitors can learn about the eruption and see how nature has slowly begun to recover from the devastation. The recovery of life around Mount St. Helens has been remarkable. In the decades since the eruption, Mount St. Helens has given scientists an unprecedented opportunity to witness the intricate steps through which life reclaims a devastated landscape. Plants and animals have gradually returned to the blast zone, though it will take many more decades for the forest to fully recover. Mount St. Helens remains active today. After its 1980 eruption, the volcano experienced continuous volcanic activity until 2008. Scientists continue to monitor the mountain carefully, using modern instruments that are far more advanced than what David Johnston had available in 1980. The story of Mount St. Helens is a reminder of the incredible power of nature and the importance of scientific research. The brave scientists who studied the mountain in 1980, especially David Johnston, showed us that understanding volcanoes can save lives. Their work continues today as scientists around the world study volcanoes to protect communities from future eruptions. Mount St. Helens changed the way that scientists do business by linking specialists from many disciplines. Now, 40 years later, it is routine for geologists, seismologists, geophysicists, hydrologists, geochemists and biologists to cooperate in studies of natural science processes. The eruption taught us that studying volcanoes requires teamwork and dedication. The mountain that once stood as a perfect snow-capped cone now bears the scars of its violent past. But those scars tell an important story about the forces that shape our planet and the scientists who risked their lives to understand them. Every time we look at Mount St. Helens today, we remember not just the destruction of May 18, 1980, but also the courage of people like David Johnston who gave their lives to protect others. The legacy of Mount St. Helens continues to influence volcano science around the world. With the experience gained at Mount St. Helens, new deformation monitoring tools have enabled scientists to reduce risks to lives and property globally. The lessons learned from this eruption have helped scientists better predict and prepare for volcanic eruptions in other parts of the world. Mount St. Helens stands today as both a natural wonder and a scientific laboratory. The crater that was blasted out in 1980 is slowly filling with a new lava dome, and life is returning to the surrounding landscape. But the mountain remains a powerful reminder that our planet is constantly changing, and that we must always respect the incredible forces of nature. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was a tragedy that took 57 lives, including that of a dedicated young scientist who believed in the importance of his work. But from that tragedy came new knowledge that has helped protect countless other lives around the world. The mountain may have lost its perfect cone shape, but it gained something perhaps more valuable, a place in history as the volcano that taught us how to better understand and prepare for the awesome power of the Earth itself. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to explore more geological wonders on our channel.